Is silence a consent or self-preservation instinct? Russia has surprised the whole world with absolute absence of mass pickets against the war with Ukraine. Only few are able to say no war in the large country with a population of 146 million people.
No war!
No war! Are they indifferent or intimidated? Are they acting as partisans or failing to act? What happens with protest attitudes against the murderous massacre? And is there any anti-war movement in Russia? Watch in our special report "The Repressive Machine Against the Truth About the War, the Cost of Anti-War Resistance in Russia." 24th February 2023, the first year of the full-scale invasion into Ukraine by Russia. The world reacted. Mass pickets took place in many big cities, almost in every capital of European countries, Caucasian countries, on different continents. Washington, Auckland, Sydney, Helsinki, Stockholm, Vilnius,
Glory to Ukraine!
Warsaw, Riga, Prague, Tbilisi, Yerevan. And there is only one country in the world where anything similar has never happened, in Russia, that initiated the murderous war against Ukraine. A year after the cynical invasion of Ukraine, we don't see any mass protests in the country with a population of 146 million people. Only a few picked up the courage to publicly speak up against the war.
No war! No war!
Results of such individual anti-war actions are almost always the same. People found to have had an anti-war attitude end up into special forces' hands. After that, law enforcement officers watch over them with special zeal in order the truth not to be revealed anywhere. During the anti-war protest on 24th February 2023, more than 50 people were detained in 14 Russian cities. Then everything happened as it was predicted to be: a paddy wagon, police station, protocol, trial, fine or sentence. Any information about the scale of the Russian war against Ukraine different from the official one is outlawed. And its spreading entails responsibility due to the law on discrediting the armed forces of the Russian Federation and fakes, and any form of anti-war protest or remark literally is covered by it.
When I saw these destroyed Ukrainian cities and that girl as small as my twins, she was torn apart and they were trying to revive her. The doctor, who was electrocuting her, trying to revive her heart, addressed Putin and said, "Look that you've done. I can't stand it. I see my children in that girl's shoes. I thought about what I could do, took this red paint with such streaks. It was just dripping like this, and I thought, let it leak. It is symbolic."
Dmitry Skurihin, entrepreneur and father of a large family from Leningrad region. At the very beginning of the full-scale war in Ukraine, he wrote anti-war slogans on his store in the village Rusko-Vysotskaya.
Russia is on the side of pure evil right now, ruled with Putinism. Putinism is that undoubted evil force that staged hell in Ukraine.
After a dozen fines and warnings for him discrediting the Russian armed forces, the criminal proceedings were instituted for the banner with condemnation of mobilization and for the poster connected to an anniversary of the full-scale invasion. Alexandra Skotelenko, an artist from St. Petersburg, is waiting for the verdict in her case. She was revealing the truth about war crimes committed by Russians in Ukraine, printing it on flyers. She replaced price tags in the supermarkets with them.
The Russian army bombed the art school in Mariupol. Around 400 people were hiding from the shell in the air.
Alexandra's replaced price tags were qualified as fakes about the Russian armed forces. She can serve 10 years in prison.
Hi, my name is Ayhau Amosov. I make music and my free time I spend in prison.
Ayhau is a popular in Yakutia punk rock musician.
From the very beginning, I was absolutely positive that the war would happen. Russia would invade Ukraine. I am an artist, and more or less people in Yakutia know me. I wanted to speak up for my compatriots to oppose this war with me.
There are several performances and actions on Ayhau's account, and several criminal proceedings and fines as well.
Many times I was called to the courts. Altogether, I've paid 130,000 rubles fine. At that moment, I had 5 administrative cases, but in autumn I continued.
After the last action, they opened a criminal case. He could have served 5 years in prison.
I had spent 41 days in isolation. I was released under the recognize not to leave, and I escaped. Right now, I am in Kazakhstan.
The law on bringing administrative and criminal responsibility for discrediting and fake news about the Russian army was unanimously enforced by the State Duma of Russia a week after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in early March 2022. Fakes stand for any information that controverses official data from the government or Ministry of Defense. Discreditation stands for any condemning saying about the war, even without mentioning Ukraine, for example, no war. And the call "Glory to Ukraine, glory to heroes" is viewed as a Nazi slogan by the Russian government. They threaten to punish especially strictly for saying it. This law has become a real weapon for suppressing anti-war protests of any kind and persecution of dissidents.
5 марта 2022 года введена в действие норма «Не войне! Не войне!».
Russian independent lawyers call persecution for so-called fakes and discreditation of Russian armed forces factual implementation of the war censorship. For the first year of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a record-high number of people were arrested for breaking the enforced law. That is, 19,586 people were detained for the public and open anti-war position. That is more than during the mass protest against the arrest of an oppositional politician Alexei Navalny in 2021.
Actions on the internet, anti-war symbols after protest or for some things in public places or private correspondence, criminal proceedings are not taken into account. What we know about the defendants in these criminal cases is that there are 463 of them at this very moment. They are prosecuted for discrediting the Russian army. Firstly, they got administrative responsibility for discrediting the Russian forced army, then they did that for the second time.
Some of the anti-war activists were sentenced to serve more years in prison than the Russian courts had imprisoned cold-blooded murderers for. Attempts to criminalize the eradicate and objectionable for the Russian government word war have reached the point of absurdity.
The lawyer that works with us was found in the court for saying the word war. She was defending an anti-war picketer and said that word twice. Every time she was fined 30,000 rubles. Lawyers who are too explicit with their anti-war position are considered to be foreign agents and get disbarred.
The law about fakes and discreditation was toughened in a year after enforcement. They increased amounts levied and prison sentences. Right now, maximum measures are 15 years of imprisonment or 5 million rubles fine.
Если мы берем Россию 22 года,
If we consider Russia in 2022, that is a state where a civil society has been thoroughly eradicated for the last 15 years, media, parliamentary parties implemented more than 10 years ago law on foreign agents, deterioration of the situation with the freedom of assembly. We can make a close analogy with the situation in the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s years of the previous century. The Great Purge in 1938 was possible to be committed only after 15 years of the Soviet government ruling. Throughout those years, so-called leftovers of civil society and political opposition had been eradicated.
имевшиеся остатки гражданского общества, политической оппозиции тщательно вытаптывались.
For a year since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, any attempts of protest or laying flowers to the self-made memorial or monument have been harshly thwarted. Even the anti-war committee of Russia, created by opposition, did not dare call people to an anti-war protest on February 24, 2023. They called to declare disagreements with the continuation of the murderous war abroad, where almost 1 million Russians went. And security officers did great work locally. On the eve of the anniversary of the full-scale invasion, they did their best for previously caught during the anti-war actions protesters not to turn up there again. They visited them with officials' warnings about inadmissibility of participation in actions. A year ago, on the day of invasion, Russian streets looked differently. At that time, the Youth Democratic Movement Vesna could organize protests, mass protests without coordination with the government. The biggest riots in Moscow and St. Petersburg gathered several thousand of people. That day, more than 107,000 picketers were arrested.
On February 24th, we declared to go out for demonstrations, for protests. Besides these rallies, we had to actively participate in the anti-war movement. We also had an idea that our pickets would protest near some stores, supermarkets, shops, and there would be people going to work or shopping, and they would meet a person who could convince them in something.
On the literally sacred day for the Russian government, Victory Day on 9th May, activists from Vesna appeared among the participants of the March of the Immortal Regiment with anti-war slogans and banners. Then, in different cities, 125 protesters were taken away in paddy wagons.
For Putin's regime, this is literally a basis of ideology. They claim to be fighting against fascism, but the real fascists sit in the Kremlin. We were trying to convey this to people, and as a result hurt the nerve of the government, and they opened criminal cases against us.
Because of everyone's persecution, an individual protest has gone underground. Anti-war slogans appear on notes, flyers, put into letters boxes, graffiti drawn on the buildings at night. But one can be persecuted in Russia even for silent protest. For Ukrainian flags on the balcony or clothes, for the shoes of the Ukrainian flag colors, for the destruction of the propaganda and agitation banners and posters, for the damage of symbols of the current war logos Z and V. A coach of the children's sports school got 90,000 rubles fine for that. Valery Yakovlev has ripped off the letter Z from the door of the educational institution twice.
I don't regret and don't boast about it. I did what I had to do. Who are these children going to be as adults if they have been programmed since childhood? Instead of teaching love, joy, music and art, we start instilling rubbish in them.
The special enemy of the Russian authorities is social networks. The security forces rummage through it with passion, looking for dissidents. Burnout journalist Maria Ponomarenko is sentenced for 6 years in prison for the post in Telegram channel about the airstrike of the Russian armed forces on the drama theater in Mariupol.
The 24th February is a tragic day for me. Before a day of arrest, I bawled my eyes out every evening. When the personalization of responsibility comes and we as Germans undergo everything they have undergone and answer for all the past crimes we had committed, then we will face changes. And by the way, now we have preconditions for that.
They also track reactions for anti-war posts. Nelly Loseva, a resident of Chita, was fined 65,000 rubles for 2 likes. The first like post was about the vain and aimless death of mobilized Russians, and the second one about Crimea's Ukrainian. Jokes on social networks are also fraught with consequences. Vasily Bolshakov, a father of a large family, is being sentenced for a joke about the withdrawal of Russian troops from Kherson.
Sergei, why are we retreating from Kherson? Volodya, because you gave us an order to free Ukraine from fascists and Nazis.
The criminal case was initiated after a few denunciations. Due to data of Roskomnadzor for the first half of 2022, Russians had written 145,000 private messages, and a part of them were about the violation of the law on discreditation and fakes about the Russian army. They denounced their acquaintances, neighbors, teachers, and even children. A resident of Moscow denounced her daughter's 8-year-old classmate because of this, in her opinion, Russophobic video. This story about Masha Moskалёва, a schoolgirl from the Tulsk region, became scandalous and resonant. In fine arts class, she made an anti-war painting and was denounced by a teacher. Her father got sentenced for 2 years but managed to escape Russia, and his daughter, being brought up only by him, was passed to her mother.
The police came to our flat and took him out. Did they show any documents, say anything? No, just didn't they use force? Was everything okay? Not in front of me, they just came in here. And what did they say to you? That they will call a social custody worker.
Wiretapping on private conversations and phone calls, social media surveillance and denunciations. The oppositionists say that this is a return to the past.
Such a situation is common for the whole former Soviet society. These denunciations, mutual suspicions, claims and such like. This culture has fully revived in Russia, and people know about it. And again, that's why it is similar to what it was like in the Soviet Union. People are summing each other's noses behind backs.
There is a real raid on users' social networks and anonymous anti-war Telegram channels. 10,000 internet resources are blocked. According to the Roskomsvoboda organization, which is trying to defend the idea of the secrecy of the private life of citizens and freedom of information, this indicates widespread military censorship in Russia.
The state claims that it has a monopoly on what to say, and it is absolutely useless to prove in courts that there is, for example, an independent examination of what happened in Bucha, that there is what international organizations believe in. There is a point of view of the Ministry of Defense. This is the only possible point of view.
While peaceful forms of protest are suppressed, others are radicalized. In different regions, military registration and enlistment offices are on fire. Relay protection cabinets are put out of action and railroad tracks are damaged. Both pupils and pensioners decide on this. Dozens of people have been detained for sabotage, and the punishment for such actions became tougher than at the very beginning of a full-scale war.
When a Molotov cocktail is thrown into the building of the military enlistment office, it can burn or not, it doesn't matter. Now such actions have begun to be counted as terrorist acts, so there are from 10 to 20 years in prison.
There are several partisan organizations. On condition of anonymity in correspondence, some representatives spoke with the editors of the special report. They said that their goal is to disrupt the supply of ammunition and equipment to the Russian troops, and they confirmed the situation they are directly related to.
Arson of the cell phone tower in village Belomestное, Belgorod region. Sabotage of rail tracks on the railway on the branch leading to the military facility. Sabotage on the railway line leading to Barsava settlement. Undermining of the bridge leading to the object of the Ministry of Defense.
Another target for the partisans is military registration and enlistment offices. They are set on fire to destroy bases and resources without which military conscription and mobilization are impossible. These actions are thoroughly planned.
We ask so many stupid, uncomfortable and awkward questions. I will burn the draft board. How will you do that? I will throw a Molotov's cocktail into a window. Let's say the cocktail won't go out, but will the window break because of it? Of course! What type of window is there? With Soviet frames, is it double-glassed? How many layers? Is there a grating? I don't know. Let's not hurry up with the actions and start with the exploration of the object.
The safety of potential partisans is the highest priority. Communication happens through anonymous mail and internet browsers with reliable protection of personal data. Manuals are in the open access in Telegram channels. Everything is sought out: precautions, legends and manures.
We don't use common cell phones, they are turned off in advance. We change our clothes, hide figures, cover hands and faces. The road passes through a zone that is guaranteed not to be viewed by cameras. Entering and going out from this zone are disguised as the usual routine activities, walking dogs, etc. I estimate that there are about 1,000 people in the partisan movement. Well, for comparison, the French resistance movement during the Second World War consisted of several hundred people. That is, the scale of resistance in Russia now is greater than it was then, but it is still very small for such a large country.
Total repressions and persecution, fines and prison terms practically suppressed the peaceful protest, which was not that numerous in the context of a huge country. It flared up with renewed vigor after the announcement of mobilization by Vladimir Putin in September 2022. Russia has been swept by a wave of protests, and the result, detentions. In Chechnya, Dagestan, Yakutia, it even came to an attack on the military commissar and attempts of self-immolation. In Makhachkala, a mass brawl broke out between protesters and security forces on the central square. In Nalchik, women came out to protect their children and husbands from mobilization.
Calm down!
It is impossible to speak calmly with you, do you get it? Knowing where children are sent.
Look!
You know better than me that they are canning fodder. None of them will come back home.
Whereas seized anti-war protests have always flared up in countries that have unleashed wars, supported a military conflict in a third country. Minor ones, for example in Serbia, which attacked Bosnia and Herzegovina, the former countries of Yugoslavia, in Russia against the war in Afghanistan. The authorities of countries that have begun hostilities against their states have always ignored the anti-war sentiments of their citizens and relied on war fanatics. Nevertheless, as the history of different countries and conflicts has shown, no matter how the authorities clamped down on the protest, it always underwent several stages of development. A Croatian Bosnian human rights activist, organizer of humanitarian missions to Chechnya, Burma and Cambodia, told a special report about this.
People coming from the middle class intelligentsia, alternative, cultural, and so on, because they are usually the first group who start to oppose it from the position of the moral indignation. They are really ashamed of the crime which have been done. But, the shame, blame, responsibility for the crimes, this is not something around what you can mobilize the broad society. The family who lost their sons and their husbands, the people who are now without parts of the body, the veterans, let's say, when they start to be the people who lost their jobs, and thousands of the people who are in factories which don't function well anymore, they are becoming much more strong, the voice.
Even the most powerful anti-war protests were not able to stop military conflicts, but they always prepared the ground for the transformation in states that cynically unleashed murderous massacres.
The wars are stopped by the military defeat of the aggressor. And now the question is, if the anti-war movements cannot stop the war, are they meaningless? I don't think that they are meaningless. So these active opponents of the war are playing very, very important role to shift the general public opinion, but that happens only when the broad society is heavily damaged and harmed by the consequences of the war.
A change in the perception of war by society even in some cases led to a regime change. This is relevant in the context of the upcoming presidential elections in Russia that are less than a year away, says a historian of the anti-war movement and public opinion researcher Melvin Small.
The most likely, from my perspective, would be for the people around Putin to toss him out. Now, if you think about it, what happened in 1968 in our country in the election, although Lyndon Johnson had quite a successful, amazing series of domestic programs when he was president, there was a feeling we should toss this guy out, is that the people around Putin will toss him out because they know the losses they've taken.
Perhaps the Russian anti-war resistance will get a leader and then the protest will become organized. Fearing or already fleeing persecution, politicians and members of the team, show business stars, IT specialists, the scientific and cultural elite left Russia. Many oppositionists like Vladimir Kara-Murza, Ilya Yashin and Alexei Gorinov are imprisoned for the same reason, for the truth about the war.
We not only don't need a leader right now, but that is also dangerous for him. As soon as any attempt to be designated as a leader is made, this person will be immediately imprisoned just the next day. Underground activity is the only thing that remains possible inside Russia today. As soon as the situation changes, it will be possible to behave differently.
And there are preconditions for this. Open anti-war resistance is emerging in the territories colonized by the Russians. Several foundations and communities have already been created in Buryatia, Dagestan, Kalmykia, Tver, Yakutia. After all, the authorities not only forbid telling the truth about the war, but also conduct covert mobilization. Meanwhile, studies show that the number of supporters of the war in Russia is declining due to the increasing amount of the coffins returned from Ukraine. Despite military censorship, intimidation, repression and criminal prosecution for the slightest mention of the war, the protest sentiments will only build up. After all, more and more Russian families will lose their loved ones in the war against Ukraine and face ever greater lies from the ruling regime, which says that it has almost no losses. The last time the Russian Ministry of Defense disclosed data was in September 2022, reporting the deaths of about 6,000 military and already then lowering the real number almost 10 times. Since then, the scale of the losses have been hushed up. And they are record high. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the average number of Russian soldiers killed in Ukraine every month is 25 times higher than in Chechnya and 35 times bigger than in Afghanistan. And the total number of those killed is several times higher than the number of fallen in all previous conflicts starting from the middle of the 20th century. In both Chechen campaigns, in the war in Donbass since 2014, as well as in conflicts in Afghanistan, Georgia, Syria, Angola, Egypt, Vietnam and other countries, the total losses of the Russian army amounted to 50,000 people. In Ukraine, for a year and more than 3 months of a full-scale war, according to the General Staff of Ukraine, the number of Russian military dead is 200,000 people. Olha Mikhaluk, special report.